Okay. Hi, Andrew. This is Dan. Thank you for joining me. Little caveat, I've known you for a long time. So why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got to start in Kamigami Robots?
Sure. My name is Andrew Gillies. I'm a co-founder and COO of Kamigami Robots. And Kamigami Robots um, designs and builds connected toys for kids that are designed to inspire them to get involved in science and engineering, robotics, mathematics, programming, things like this. So our products right now are build-it-yourself robot kits that sort of come as different flat sheet components, and they fold and snap together into robots that they then can drive around from a smart device like a tablet or smartphone, and they can play games with each other. They can learn some basic principles of coding and generally have a blast getting involved in sort of the earliest stages of robotics.
Okay. And what's your background? Where'd you come from?
Sure. So it's a little bit of a varied background. Traditionally, I've trained as a mechanical engineer. So I did a PhD in mechanical engineering at UC Berkeley, and I worked in a robotics lab doing bio-inspired robotics and material system research in a few different areas. I was more on the material system design, but I worked with a lot of other folks designing robots similar to the ones that we developed at Kamigami Robots.
Okay. And so how long ago did Kamigami start and who started it?
Sure. So my co-founder Nick Kohut and I first started talking about doing something with the robots. This would have been sort of early 2013. We would sort of take the robots to these outreach events as part of the research lab, and we would just be exhibiting, sort of showing off what we were doing in the lab, sort of an academic sense. But we would have sort of kids and parents come up to us and say, "Oh, can we buy these things? Are they available for sale?" And we'd be like, "Well, no, it's a research project." Um, but at some point along the way there, we thought, "Wow, there's so many people that are actually interested in this. It's sort of like a toy or educational tool. Maybe there's something there." So we started talking about forming the company, which we knew very little about what that process was like. We had no business training. We had no exposure to the startup world. I think I barely even knew what an entrepreneur was. This is when Kickstarter was like barely a thing. It was just coming on people's radar at that point in time. Um, so yeah, we sort of had the idea that maybe this could be a company, and sort of just started reaching out to folks and asking questions about like what that would look like.
Okay. So how did you get your start money-wise then? What options were open to you at Berkeley or just kind of in the general public realm?
Sure. So when we first decided that, yeah, we were going to actually give this a shot, there were sort of four of us involved in the early stages. There was Nick and I, and then another two folks, Paul Berkmeyer and Kevin Peterson. And the four of us sort of rallied around this idea and said, okay, well, we might need a little bit of money to get going. So each of us kicked in $1,000 to start, just to like have a little, we opened up a company bank account, and each put in $1,000 there. So that was sort of like our tiny little seed money. And from there, we sort of started researching. We thought there were a few different avenues. Sort of investing in venture funding was something that we had no familiarity with whatsoever. Like we didn't even know those existed as a concept. So we knew Kickstarter existed, so we thought that was a pretty good path forward for us. We knew that there were some government grants available for sort of startup companies. There's sort of NSF programs that can give small companies a sort of a little bit of money to get started. So we're looking into those. And then right around that time, Berkeley started a hardware startup incubator called the Foundry. Um, they had sort of just announced this program. They hadn't talked about any sort of real money at that point. It was mostly in-kind services, and I think think they ended up settling in about $5,000 of in-kind services, which pretty much means that like they don't write you a check for $5,000. They just provide you with, or somewhere around $5,000 budget that they'll spend on your behalf on tools, materials, that sort of thing. So we applied. I think there were about 30 or 40 teams that sort of applied to that first round, and we were one of the 5 teams that was selected as part of that first round. And that would have been sort of the winter and spring of 2013, and that was sort of our first like real big break. That it was like, okay, so someone else thinks this could be a real thing.
Yeah.
Someone else is willing to put at least a little bit of their money behind it.
Cool.
So that was sort of our first start there.
So it sounds like a mix. So that was your start, and then you moved on to a couple other crowdfunding sources later.
Yeah. So once we had that down, we sort of set our eyes on running a crowdfunding campaign, and again, like we had no background in business whatsoever. Like we were all just engineers. So we had the technical side covered pretty well, but in terms of how to structure a business plan, how to think about like what financials would be required, like all that, we just had no idea. So we pretty much saw a couple other Kickstarters that were raising around, a couple $100,000, $100,000. And we're like, okay, let's do that. That's like a lot of money. Let's set our goal towards that. And like literally for that first few months, the only thing we really were focused on was running a Kickstarter campaign, which we ended up doing. It took us like 4 or 5 months. So we had that $4,000 in the bank. We pretty much used that to prep for the crowdfunding campaign, getting a video filmed, getting some of the prototypes a little bit further along, getting some of the sort of like media and other assets around it. And then we ended up running that. We raised about $75,000 through the first crowdfunding campaign. And then that was like, okay, now we have actually money to do real things at that point.
Okay.
So that was like our first actual money coming into the company.
Yeah.
Was that first Kickstarter campaign.
Let's go straight into the meat and potatoes of what we're going to talk about today. So why don't you tell me a little bit about your process? So obviously there are lots of different design and development approaches. So can you outline what references you used in terms of developing a product, how you learned how to move from being an engineer to being an entrepreneur?
Sure. So one of the resources that we lean on a lot is the Lean Startup methodology that Steve Blank developed. And a huge focus there is on what they call the customer development process. I think there's probably a few different terms for this, but the main idea, and I think this is what's especially hard for engineers, is that you really have to get your ideas out of the building. There's such a tendency for someone with an engineering or technical background to just start developing something right away. Like we like to build things, right? Like that's like what we do. We like to sort of come up with ideas and then get pen to paper and then fire up our 3D printers and laser cutters and prototyping tools and pull out the Arduinos and start hacking things together. But the problem is that like we're building around an idea that exists only in our own heads, right? And the reality of product development is that you are creating something for someone elsewhere that almost always isn't just yourself. And as soon as you start developing something without having them in the loop, you're going to start to stray from something that's actually going to be useful for that customer. So Steve Blank in his Lean Startup methodology really stresses this point that like as early in the process as possible, you need to be out of the lab, out of the building. You have to pick up the phone. You have to hit the streets. You have to do whatever it is you have to do to get in front of those customers and hear what they have to say. And it's not, there's sort of a few different stages that we go through when we're either coming up with a new product idea or even just introducing a feature or improving a feature that we already have. So really the first stage is just how well can you understand sort of the problem that you're trying to solve for that customer. And that first interview process for us was, it looked like first you have to figure out who that customer is, right? And for us, we did a lot of online research to see like who is mostly buying these sort of educational, STEM toys, STEM robot toys. And for us, we were looking at sort of competitors' products, looking at other profiles, looking at other data that had been published, and sort of figured out that, it's generally kids in sort of the age 8 to 12 sort of age range, and that it's mostly moms that are buying these products for their 8-year-old kids. So you work backwards and say, okay, that means, moms between the age of like, mid to late 30s to mid to late 40s. So it's like, okay, so now we have sort of like a basic idea of who we need to start talking to. And then the next phase is like, okay, well, let's go talk to as many of these people as possible. Because the closer you can align your viewpoint with what their viewpoint is, the more successful you're going to be when you actually start building something, because you're going to be keeping their perspective in mind as you're building. So those first interviews, you're not showing them anything. Like, ideally, you're not talking about your product at all. You just want to hear about what their experiences have been with similar products, what they're hoping for, what, like what's going to fit into their life and what's going to fill their expectations. And so I did a lot of these interviews personally. Like, there was a period of time there when I was literally on my bike, biking around all over North Berkeley to different people's homes. Like, I would go to their homes, and like finding these people was a struggle, right? Because I'd be, as a grad student, you don't have very many like 35 to 45-year-old moms as friends.
Your network isn't very big.
Yeah, the network size was really small, and at first it was really hard reaching these folks. We tried a few different, we posted sort of, things on Craigslist and a few other places. Eventually, where we worked our way into it, we found out that there's a lot of these like local sort of email lists for moms that they sort of share different information through.
Yeah.
And we kind of stumbled across that through one of our contacts.
Right.
And there's like these sort of almost like mom study group things, right, where they like email. They might have, some of these lists are pretty huge. Like, some of them have thousands of moms on it.
Yeah.
Some of them are pretty small, just dozens.
There's actually one in our town. There's one Gilbert Moms, Mesa Moms, all these. Yeah, I know what you're
exactly.
talking about. Yep.
So we didn't know that existed, but we kind of stumbled across that, and then realized that once we had a handful of contacts, just like 2 or 3 contacts, we could use them to plug ourselves into those networks. And we offered a little bit of incentive. Like, at the beginning, I think we were offering like $20 or $30 as like an Amazon voucher in exchange for an in-person interview that would last probably an hour to an hour and a half or so.
Okay.
And then it just so then we actually had some pretty good momentum in terms of like contacts and networks. But there was a period of time there, probably, I want to say that period it lasted almost a couple months or so, where literally all I was doing was scheduling interviews, coordinating, collecting information, and riding my bike all over sort of East Bay, in the Bay Area here, doing these interviews.
Yeah.
And then like aggregating that data.
What did you learn? Like, what were the key takeaways from all of that experience? Right.
So with toys, it's a little bit tricky. I think that there's a lot of products like this where your user and your customer aren't necessarily the same person.
Right.
And you have to think about what the implications of that are in terms of what your messaging is going to be, and sometimes how you even design the product. For us, obviously, the parents are the ones that are going to be buying the product, but the kids are going to be using it, right?
Right.
So you have to think, like, first of all, like, who who are you sort of designing that messaging for, right? So if you're designing, there's a choice we had to make there that like, okay, well, is the messaging going to be geared towards the parents or the kids, right? Ultimately, you want the product to be like to have high engagement, to like be used a lot, to sort of to teach them something.
Right.
But there's sort of two different approaches there.
So you talked to more parents, it sounds like, in the beginning. What were their needs?
Right, right. So that was the other tricky thing is there's sort of because we're developing a toy, it's different than solving a specific problem, right? There's sort of like people talk about it as it's like vitamin, like pills and vitamins, right? Like are you selling a vitamin that like help, or are you selling a cure to something? And for us, we were more in that sort of entertainment category. So we really had to figure out like, okay, well, how do we fit into the products that are already out there, and what do they like about what's already out there, and what do they don't like, and what sort of failed. So for us, what we started to realize is that a lot of these other products, sort of electronic products that parents had used, had a fairly closed play pattern. Like there wasn't, it was a very sort of scripted closed play pattern where there's no chance for sort of this open-ended creative play pattern is what we ended up sort of coining it. And that the toys that the parents thought were really successful, the ones that, the kids really engaged with, were ones that foster this more sort of open-ended creative play pattern.
Right.
So right from the beginning, we're like, okay, well, let's hone in on that and say like, okay, how can we design the product to foster that sort of open-ended play where it's not like a script. It's something right. That's structured in a way that the kids can build upon it.
Okay.
Which is what we ended up doing sort of on the software side within the app.
Yeah.
We kind of planted the seeds there.
So all in all, how many people would you say you interviewed in that first section of your business?
Yeah, so I'd say probably it ended up being around 30 to 40 interviews.
Okay. Somewhere
in that ballpark. I think that I did a lot of research around how many people should you interview, like how many, and that, again, this was people that we interviewed without showing them a prototype.
Yeah.
Right? Like we're just, like, I can't stress this enough. It's more about listening than trying to sell them something, right? Like because if you think about it, like if you're a founder of a company and you have like your first little prototype and you take this to a customer and be like, oh, look at this thing I built, they're not gonna smash it in front of you.
They want you to succeed.
They want you to succeed. Like people are gonna look for the parts that they like, and they're not gonna tell you the parts that they don't like. Yeah. Like you're gonna get sort of it's a false positive, right? They're just gonna validate something. You need to be a little sneakier than that, right? You want to try to invalidate, right? To see like, is this like, you want to sort of ask them the questions to lead them to the point where they're either saying that, yeah, something like that would be useful, or no, I would never use something like that.
Right.
Like ideally you get to the point where and you have to keep refining your questions too, right? Because you're going to get yourself into like weird little places where the questions will either like diverge and you start getting like answers kind of all over the map, which means that you're probably not focused enough, or your customers, you're interviewing folks that are like let's see how I'm going to describe it, like your customers are too different, right? Like you're not focused enough on who you're interviewing, right? Like if I'm interviewing a mom of a 6-year-old and a mom of a 12-year-old, and I'm thinking that's the same customer, but I'm getting very different answers, it means that I'm not focused enough. It means like, okay, I can only interview moms that are 10 to 12-year-olds, not 6 to 12-year-olds, because I'm getting very different answers.
Because their needs for a 6-year-old, their needs for a 10-year-old are going to be completely different, and so you're not
exactly. Yeah. So as you're asking them these questions, you need to sort of be looking for those repeating patterns, and when you start, you're doing well when you start to do several interviews in a row, and you're getting to the point where you can almost predict what they're going to say, right? And then what they're saying there, like as what they're expressing as their need, it becomes your sales pitch, right? Like what you do is you take, like you can hear what that expression is, like, oh, actually, now that you mention it, blah 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 would be, like this is an issue with these other things, like this is an issue with this toy, or that was why that toy was so successful, and like this is why I bought it, right? Whatever that line is there becomes sort of your main message. Like you take, so the best marketing messages are ones that are taken from the customers, right? Like, and will still do this to this day. Like we'll get customer feedback, we'll get testimonials, so, through email or whatever, and it's people describing why they love the robot and like why it resonates with them. That becomes our marketing message. That becomes like sort of the lighthouse that we steer towards.
Right.
So that's what that process looks like.
Cool. So what are, just maybe quickly, what other ways did you learn about user needs other than by talking to people? Were there other sources?
Yeah, absolutely. So I really like this trick a lot. It's pretty effective, at least for consumer-facing products, is find out who your competitors are, like look for sort of what the closest analog product to yours on the market is, and go to Amazon and start reading reviews that people are leaving there, right? That's like immediate feedback that you can get to figure out, like, okay, here's a similar product. What are the issues that people having? What do they like about it? What do they don't like? What did that company fail at doing? Is it like, oh, this is a great product, but the batteries die way too soon and I can't use it, or the Bluetooth connection is flaky. Like, look for those repeating patterns, and now you know like what the sore points are, or what the successes are, right? Like, oh, I love that, if you read like 12.5 comments about how awesome it is that the like eyes can change color with a certain, like you can change the pattern of the eye blinking or something like that. Well, it's like, okay, well, that's a specific example, but it's like, that's probably a pretty important feature to your customers. You probably want to think about including that.
So it sounds like Amazon was one source. Any other sources? Did you, maybe not just user interviews, but other types of venues where you could get user interviews or just get user feedback?
So events were another huge one for us, right? So now you're talking about having a prototype, having something that kids can play with and that parents can see their kids playing with, see how they react. So now you're really opening up a lot of other possibilities, right? So we have done tons of events all over the place, large and small. Like there was a period of time where there was no middle school science fair too small for us to take the robots to and get it in front of like 30 or 40 people. And now you can start getting your product in front of a ton of people.
Right.
Of course, for us, Maker Faire was sort of like the marquee event of the year. San Mateo Maker Faire in the Bay Area here is it's well over 100. I think it was well over 100,000 people show up every year. I think it's something like 150,000 people, and we'll have a booth there, and we'll probably interact over the 3-day event. We'll probably interact with like literally over 2,000 folks will come through our booth, and we'll see them playing with the product, and we'll hear all the questions. And we'll be lobbing questions at it as well.
So, but this sounds like it's also when you have a product, now you maybe expand your user testing to different venues. So maybe this wouldn't have been useful earlier, or you just weren't thinking about it, or not in that zone.
I think it depends on the scale of the event. I think at some point when you have a good idea of what your prototype should look like.
Right.
Obviously, you want to keep that sort of customer in the loop the entire time. So at some point, your sort of one-on-one interviews can transition into sort of showing prototypes and having people interact with things. We also ran focus groups as well. So we had, these are a little harder to organize, but pretty high value, where you have folks in and it could just be like, a few kids or even just like a couple kids come in and sort of try to evaluate the product and see how they interact with it. Um, one aspect of our product that we tested repeatedly for many months, that was probably one of the biggest challenges for us, is how the kit was actually built. Because it's sort of a do-it-yourself robot and it's for kids, we wanted to make sure that this thing is actually buildable, that the kids can actually build it themselves. And we almost got burned really bad by this because we sort of had this notion of what would be easy to build. But again, we stated, like, this is a big mistake we made is that we stayed in the building way too long designing the robot before ever testing this. And man, I'll never forget, we did this this event at the museum, at the Children's Creativity Museum in downtown San Francisco, and they invited us over to do this, like, Sunday afternoon build session. Come build robots with Kamigami robots, right? So this is to the public. This is an event. They paid for admission to the museum, and now they're doing this, like, free build a robot seminar. Wow. It was the first time we ever had kids coming to try to build a robot, and so there's probably, I'd say probably a dozen or a dozen and a half parents with their kids that showed up to this build a robot seminar, and right from the starting bell, we knew it was going to be a crazy disaster. Like, nobody could build a robot at all. It was a nightmare. Like, there was kids crying. There's literally parents, like, yelling at us about, like, what is this? Because they don't know that they're all of a sudden victims to your testing scheme, right? Like, they just think they're having some fun Sunday afternoon, and the next thing you know, it's like mayhem, and like, none of the robots came even close to getting built. And there's actually 2 sessions that day, and so there's, like, a morning session and the afternoon session. And after the morning session, we were just like, I remember Nick and I were sitting there just, like, having lunch waiting for the second session to start, just being like, should we just shut down the whole company? Like, is it over? Like, we're so far from anything that's like, this is, how did we think, like, what were we thinking that an 8-year-old would be able to do? Like, we were so far away from anything that they could build. It was embarrassing. So that became a huge focus for us. Was like, okay, we have to completely rethink how this thing can be assembled by an 8-year-old. Yeah. So we got really aggressive about it. This became sort of the next phase of, like, okay, so sourcing parents is one thing, but how do you get a room full of, like, 8 to 10-year-olds ready to build a robot for an hour and a half? That's sort of the next problem. So that we could do sort of these improvements around the building of the kits. Yeah. So again, we got a little bit lucky. We stumbled across a volunteer group, an organization in the Bay Area, sort of a community science outreach program that connects Bay Area Bay Area professionals with different schools, like, middle schools and grade schools throughout the Bay Area, and sort of has them come to the classroom, come to a science classroom, and just give a lesson to the kids for an hour. So we ended up sort of forming a partnership with them where we would be like, okay, well, we can do a lesson on robotics. We'll go, and all of a sudden now we have access to, like, all these schools all over the Bay Area. Yeah. And it was sort of like, okay, well, we can come in here, we'll bring a bunch of kids and have the kids attempt to build the robot. And then, we'll also have pre-built prototypes there. So we'll do a little lesson on, like, what is a robot? What are the different parts of a robot? Okay, let's try to build some robots and then play with some robots after. Okay. That little part about let's try to build the robot, obviously that's where we're sneaking in our user testing. And we were going to schools. That whole process lasted about 6 months or so, 6 or 7 months, where we were just constantly being like, okay, we need to improve the materials. We need to improve the simplicity of this. We need to clarify the assembly instructions. and we would score classrooms based on like how many kids finished the robot by the end of the class. We would have a little questionnaire for the kids they would fill out like how much did they enjoy it, how difficult did they think it was, and sort of build this aggregate score. And then we would of course have our own sort of qualitative observations around what steps in the build process were kids having the most trouble with, hone in on those, redesign those components.
Right.
And we would just do this over and over again. And from that first visit to the Children's Creativity Museum, and probably, I guess it was maybe closer to 7 or 8 months later, we could pretty confidently walk into a classroom, like a grade 4, grade 5 classroom, and know that like by the end of an hour-long class, 80% of the kids would be able to build the robot perfectly without any real input from us.
So that second time around, when you really focused on the kids, you said you had only really talked to, 30 or so in terms of the interviews beforehand. How many did you kind of expand to in the second round of users testing?
I think in terms of the number of kids that we had interact with the product or build the product, it was well over a couple hundred kids.
Okay.
By the time we were all done with it.
So
classes.
Maybe we can move on really briefly, because I know you have to move on soon, to talking about benchmarking and generating your specs. Now, Dash was already a product. Dash was the name of the device before it turned into Kamigami. So how did you determine, first of all, what your competitors were and what your device needed to be able to do? Like, what were the metrics you needed to evaluate yourself against?
Right. So one of the big metrics in toys is sort of cost of goods and like retail price. So alongside the testing we were doing with kids, we were also, continued to collect data around parents and try to figure out sort of like the price sensitivity to certain products. And this is something that we continue to do this day. But we knew that there were certain prices, like retail prices, that we knew if we get hit, there would be like a huge change in sort of the market that we could address. We had seen other products, like we knew, like Lego Mindstorms as a competing product, that was sort of in the $350 to $400 range, and there have been other products that were sort of $100 plus, like $150, $180, and they had decent feature sets, but through our interviews we realized that like at some point it doesn't matter how many more features you're adding, the price is just too much no matter what. Okay. So we knew that getting the cost down was going to be one of the most critical things we did, and we really set out there and said, okay, well, what are the sort of given this cost structure, what are the features that we can fit into that, sort of the key features that we can get in there, still make a reasonably decent value proposition and maintain that price so we can hit the market that we want to hit.
Yeah.
In terms of what features we chose to include, it really came down to what we saw the kids using the most when we were doing our play testing. We knew that the building was super important. We knew that some of the interactive features that allow the kids to sort of play robot to robot was super important. So having some sort of like social interactive element was super important. And we knew that sort of like the way the robot could move around on its own and sort of like just its motion itself was super important. So we focused on those and said like, okay, well, given this cost structure, like how can we enable those features and do as much as we can on the software side without adding too much cost on the hardware side.
So before you have to go right now, I wanted to ask a little bit about concept generation. So Dash was already a thing. So you were basically, you had this device, and then you had all of this feedback that you were getting, before you started creating a product, but you had to kind of somehow bring those two together. How did you what types of concepts did you generate in terms of solving the problems of making it more buildable, converting this device that was, a laboratory thing to something that kids can play with? How did you iterate, create concepts, test them, validate them? But really on the
Right,
concept
right.
generation side.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of that tricky creative process, right? Like, I don't think you're talking about like bringing in new ideas, brainstorming, doing research on competitors' products, trying to listen to what the parents are saying. So I don't know if there's really a too specific sort of path to follow on this. It's mostly, there's sort of a light bulb moment where it's like, okay, this idea is, could be really successful. Going back to something I was mentioning earlier, we knew from the parents that fostering some sort of creative, open-ended play is important. And one of the things that we sort of identified when we were watching kids play with the robot is that when there was more than one kid playing with a couple of robots, they would very quickly start to have this sort of social interaction where they would like generate their own sort of games, right? Like they would be coming up with their own sort of games and rules, and that we thought was like, okay, well that's pretty interesting concept for an open-ended play pattern, is like giving them the ability to kind of create their own games and have this social interaction, right? Because as soon as you have a friend involved, now there's the ability to actually like generate something new. You're not just like doing the same thing over and over again because you're competing with a friend.
Right.
So we knew that having the ability for the robots to interact in some way was going to enable that. So then it just became sort of a search for like what is the best way that we can have the robots sort of interact with each other that's going to allow them to kind of play different games. It's going to allow the kids to create different games with them. And we went through a few different concepts, like should the robots like detect when they bump into each other? Should there be like some sort of like contact sensor on there? We played around with sort of electromechanical whisker systems. We put around with Hall sensors. We kind of prototype these things and just sort of mocked up like what would sort of a game mechanic look like with sort of robot to robot play. And eventually at some point there we played with sort of an IR communication system where the robot could like shoot out an IR signal that the other robot would respond to, and there'd be like a little IR array. Yeah. And we just hacked up on the existing robot this little IR array and just coded up like a simple game. And it was like late one night. I brought the prototype over to Nick's kitchen, and we played this very first game of like essentially robot laser tag, like on his kitchen floor, and it was really fun. Like it was like super hacky. It like just barely worked, but there was that like kernel in there that was like, okay, well that's actually something that's. Are you there, Dan?
Yeah. I'm here. I can hear you. You broke up a little bit, but we can keep going.
Okay.
Sorry, maybe to wrap it up, it sounds like creating concepts about how kids interact with the robot was just as important as the actual physical platform that they build and put together, and creating the maybe modifying the structure of the robot so that it was easier. But all in all, how many prototypes did you make from the beginning of the process to the end?
We have a big bin in the back with all the different, we call it the robot graveyard. There's easily over 100 different prototypes in that robot graveyard.
Are we talking?
As a reminder of like how quickly we went through different prototypes, but like I would say multiple hundreds.
Right. And are we talking about prototypes that like full prototypes or partial prototypes? Like how did you prototype? Like what was your process of prototyping and using that prototype to understand something?
Right. It's everywhere in between. Like we would go to a full prototype once we think a subsystem, was worthy of moving to the next stage. But for sure, we were prototyping just the transmission, just the building portion, sort of like the kit portion, just the IR system, and then when each of these sort of seemed like they're functional on their own, then we would build a full prototype.
Yeah.
And then there's sort of the aesthetic part too, right? Like there's sort of the inner workings of the robot. There's the we sort of go with this like the works like prototype and then the looks like prototype. Yeah. Right. So we have something that meets all the functionality, and this goes for the software as well, right? Like there's the functionality. So we played with different prototypes for how you would drive the robot. Was the iPad going to be like tilt drive? Was it going to be sort of like tank tread? Was it going to be a joystick? And we had like really quick and dirty prototype with a not very pretty UI, but we would give it to kids and have them try these different driving control systems and see which one they found most intuitive. It's true on the software and the hardware side. And you sort of once you have the subcomponent that you think is pretty successful, that gets sort of incorporated into the whole.
So I think that's probably all we have time for now. I hope maybe we can pick it up in the future. So thank you, Andrew, for stopping by and helping us out, learn a little bit about what a real company is like when you're going from a engineering project to a product that you're trying to sell. I really appreciate your time. And hopefully we can do this again.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.